Good morning, everybody.
Good morning.
How's everybody doing? Good. Good. I'm the education department. But welcome to Primetime Community Library. Primetime Community Library is a collaboration with Friends of the Library and the Beyond the Classroom for the entire community. Next Thursday, April 26th, several of the students who are part of this year's Open Spring Break Tour will share their experiences and give fun presentation as well. Today, Dr. Jay Rasmus will present the last part of the three-part Talk About Teaching series entitled Are Your Students Learning? Creating Well-Designed Performance Assessment Items. Can we welcome Jay this morning?
Thank you, Steve. I'm not normally dressed in a white shirt and tie, as most of you know here. I'm tired of Keith being the best-looking guy at this thing, the best-dressed guy. So I figured I'm just going to see if I can take him on here a little bit. So thanks for coming. I appreciate it. Nathan gets the prize for repeat visitors to these assessment workshops. It's been good. But no, thanks. Well, we'll be like Keith said, this will be the third part in the series. Last month we were focusing on traditional assessment and really how to write those well. And if you didn't attend that session, and if you'd like a little handout for it, shoot me an email and I can send you something. And what I do is lay out in that particular handout, lay out some guidelines for writing well-written true-false, matching multiple choice items, essay items, that type of thing. So if you didn't get that and you're interested, let me know. Today's focus will be on performance assessment, and we're really going to have 4 learning targets. I'm ambitious with the amount of time we have here, but we're going to go for 4 things. And I would say by the end of the time that we have here, I think you should have a pretty good sense of what some of the basics are, of performance assessment. By that I mean kind of what they are, when they were developed, where they were developed, why they were developed. So kind of a who, what, when, where, why, of performance assessment. And then also by the end of the session, I'd like you to really have a good sense of how you can put together a well-written performance assessment. And then third, we'll take a look at some scoring devices that you can use to give students feedback. And these are 4 devices I built that I think are instructor-friendly. By that I mean they're not the kind of thing that's going to take you hours and hours and hours to respond to a set of papers, or projects that students have done. And then we're going to finish off taking a look at what some of the research shows about providing feedback to students. We hear a lot about it at Bethel. We know it's an important thing. So let's look at what some of the research has to say. A pretty good sense of these 4 things. When we talk about performance assessment, I like to contrast it with traditional assessment. And with traditional assessment, like we looked at last month, really what that's requiring students to do is just to select something. They need to select a response from a short, true, false, short answer, matching, multiple choice. Performance assessment now all of a sudden gets a little more complex. It's not just selecting something, but we're really asking students to shape or create a response. Okay? So this is going to be really one of the purposes of performance assessment, when we truly want them to shape or create something. I would also say it's really appropriate to use when we're moving away from what are thought of being kind of lower level on Bloom's taxonomy to traditionally moving more to upper level type things. Okay? So I'm generalizing here, saying this is lower level, this is upper level. I'm really generalizing, but I think there would be some truth to that. I would say that it's not appropriate to use performance assessment if you're just trying to measure things that would be more at the knowledge level, comprehension level. There's quicker, more efficient ways to do that. Okay, so performance assessment's a good fit when you want them to shape or create something. I just want to read something real quick here too, and I just wanted to do a little more thinking about when it's appropriate to use performance assessment. And I think I can be a little more profound reading this than trying to wing it, so I'm just going to read quickly what I wrote here. Performance assessment's also appropriate when an instructor wishes to allow for problem formation. This encourages the student to go beyond what happens in traditional assessment and promotes seeing the bigger picture. Students are allowed to explore why this question even exists. They're allowed to think about the problem with a more global view and then are required, out of problem-solving necessity, to organize their ideas to come up with a solution. The beauty is this allows the students to integrate multiple types of evidence in pursuit of the expected result. is good for the student to explore and use their knowledge and experience to apply to the proposed problem. This will open the door to originality that cannot be replicated through traditional assessment formats. Okay? I think just kind of getting at some of the appropriateness of performance assessment. What we're going to do today is we're really going to look at four, Matt, I'm going to use one of your terms here, we're going to look at 4 content chunks. And at the end of each content chunk, I'm just going to stop. Okay? And at that point, I'd like to hear any thoughts you have, any feelings you have, any reactions you have, any questions you have. So I'm going to do a very quick little stand and deliver on 4 content chunks, and then I'd like to hear what your thoughts are. Normally I kind of plan more real specific interaction pieces. This one's not quite so much. Okay, so I really want to hear what your thoughts are. And I'm going to stop probably 4 times as we go in here. Okay, in terms of the who, what, when, where, why kind of a performance assessment, let's look first of all at what it is. Okay, let's just investigate that. Okay, and I'd like to use this as a definition, and this is one that I put it together, but it's based on the work of several other people. And I'm just going to give you time to read through it yourself. The words that I've underlined are the ones that I think really hold the essential meaning, to what that particular definition is. So just take a quick look at it if you would. I think it's important to make this point here, the predetermined criteria. That is something that's shared with students. Okay? It's not just something that you have in your mind, but they have every right to know what this criteria is that you're going to be applying, at some point in time. So that's what I'd like to use as a definition. You can kind of hear your thoughts on it in a second here too. All right, let's take a look at the when and where did it originate. Because with any kind of thing that appears to be new in education, I always love to do this. I like to figure out when did this originate and really where did it come from. Because oftentimes you can tell if an educational innovation, if you want to call it that, has lasting power by figuring out where it comes from. Okay, is it a grassroots type thing? Is there some history to it? Or is it something that's being mandated by the state of Minnesota or by the provost or whatever? So I always like to look at this when we're kind of digging into something that appears new. In terms of the when on this one actually goes all the way back to biblical times. Thinking back to the teaching that Jesus did. Jesus didn't use a lot of multiple choice tests. As he was working with his disciples, he would work with them. It would be a constant interaction with them, and then he would send them off to do things. The disciples would go off, and they would have some experience. They'd come back. They'd really process that with him. Okay, so we go back to biblical times with real performance assessment. Thinking of in the times of Socrates, for example, when Socrates was working with his students, if he wanted them to engage in a coherent argument of some way, it was not a true-false test that he gave them to measure whether or not he could do that. He would engage with them, in that argument. As we move into medieval times, now all of a sudden many of the great teachers had more students, than Jesus had or Socrates had. And all of a sudden we've got larger classes. That's the era when a lot of more written exams, came into play then, and oral exams that came into play. So is performance assessment a new thing? I mean, absolutely not. It's actually about as old as you can possibly get. Where did it originate? The United States, we love to claim all the great, new educational innovations. I mean, it did not start with us. I mean, like we talked about, it goes back to, ancient Greek times and way back. There's a number of other countries right now that really are moving more into performance assessment and have for years. For example, Canadians, the British, Italians, Germans, Russians, Dutch. For years and years and years, they've had performance assessments. And often much of the European educational system is based on that concept of oral exams, which really is a performance assessment. So it's clearly not a new phenomenon, and we can't claim it. It's not something that's just ours. But why the interest now? Because it is gaining popularity, in the United States. And I think one of the reasons certainly is that we're concerned about higher level thinking skills. We recognize that for our students, when they leave Bethel, They better be able to do more than just give you the basic facts of things. I mean, there's other ways to find those. We need people that can truly think. We need to be moving up to that analysis, synthesis, evaluation level. So that's a big driver of it. I also think that that we're recognizing that performance assessment better reflects current learning theory. And I'm thinking in particular of the idea of the constructivist perspective. And that theory would hold that as learners, we are continually constructing new meaning. Every student that walks into your classroom has some set of knowledge about whatever it is you're talking, and you're adding pieces to that schema they have. They are literally constructing meaning, and everybody is walking out with something a little bit different based on whatever that understanding was that they had coming in. So those connections are being built. But what we're seeing with performance assessment is that actual assessment really is an instructional tool. Okay, it's not just something that we're giving them a grade on, but it truly is a learning experience. Any good performance assessment really should extend that learning beyond what happened just in the classroom. So we're finding it's not only an assessment, but it's really a learning tool in a sense too. And I think we've also got increased interest because we're seeing, especially in the K-12 setting now, that assessments drive instruction. And we're fortunate at Bethel here that we don't have all kinds of state tests that we need to answer to and that type of thing. But the bottom line is that we do allow our assessments to shape what we teach. And I would contend that's good. I mean, that's a healthy practice. And the contention here is that if you design assessments particularly well, and if you teach to those assessments, that actually is a healthy process. That is something that's really going to profit the students. I really do believe that a good performance assessment, there's really a lot of scaffolding that needs to happen before the student really encounters that performance assessment. And by scaffolding, I mean you need to think, what are the pieces the student absolutely must have in place before they can be successful in the performance assessment? And in a sense, you might call that teaching to the test, but it's really helping that student be prepared to be successful, with what your performance assessment's going to be. Often performance assessments that don't make it, that don't work well, often the reason is that background knowledge was not built, that scaffolding was not there. The students just didn't have what they needed to have in order to be successful with that performance assessment. And I think another factor driving it is just increased student motivation. And generally speaking, I'm sure you've learned this, that the more real life you can make your instruction, the more meaning and purpose students see behind what they're doing, the greater their motivation levels. And there's actually a pretty significant body of research on this showing that performance assessment will increase motivation levels. And there's obviously a strong connection between motivation and actual learning that takes place. So the general principle of performance assessments is the more real life you can make them, generally the more effective they are because the student sees why we're doing this. They make that connection between your class and what the real world, might be in some way. So I think that's an additional factor as well, too. I do want to raise some concerns about performance assessment. We've been talking in the States now for probably 20 years about performance assessment, and I've seen a lot of them. I work in a lot of K-12 environments, but I work in this college environment, too. And these are ones that I'm going to raise right now. These are some concerns that I would have. And none of these are small matters. Okay? The first one is the issue of validity. And when we talk about validity, we're talking about, in a sense, we're talking about accuracy. Are you accurately measuring, what learning really took place? One of the issues with performance assessment is because they tend to take quite a while for a student to do. It's often difficult to sample that understanding in multiple ways. So you might have a good performance assessment where you're really trying to sample their understanding, but that's it. That's kind of your one performance assessment to measure that outcome or maybe that collection of outcomes. So often we have trouble with, it's called content validity, and that has to do with adequately sampling everything that was taught. So performance assessments are typically one thing, and it's often not multiple measures of a particular learning. So you can have issues with validity. Another issue, no small thing, would be reliability. And with reliability, really what we're talking about is consistency. And normally the way that you improve reliability in assessments is by increasing the number of items that are involved. So if you want to improve the reliability of your multiple choice exams, typically you actually increase the number of items, assuming that they're well-written items. We run into issues with performance assessment on reliability simply because it's really hard to just all of a sudden increase all the amount of performance assessment you're giving them. You know, some of the performance assessments I give, I know students have got 10 to 15 hours tied up in it by the time they finish doing it. So it's hard to really ensure that reliability simply because you're limited with the number of performance assessments. And then the third issue that we want to raise is generalizability. And again, another really important concept. And often with performance assessments, they're set in a context of some sort. Okay? You're putting them in some chunk, in some piece of what it is that they've been learning. And it's often difficult, I think, to generalize to another setting and say, because the student was good at this performance assessment, I can say with any degree of certainty that they would be good at something that looks similar to it, you know, in some way. To me, one of the biggest issues, the biggest concerns with performance assessments is that they're often not written very well. Okay? And when a true-false item isn't written well, a matching item, multiple choice isn't written well, it really causes problems, you know, with validity, reliability, generalizability. And the same thing holds true with performance assessments. Okay, I think we have a lot of people that want to do them well, but they may not necessarily be terribly well written. Okay, and when they're not well written, then you run into issues with all of these as well too. Okay, so in a little bit, we're going to take a look at some suggestions maybe on how to write these things well. And I'm going to kind of present a model a little bit here. But let's stop and just kind of hear some thoughts, feelings, reactions, questions, kind of to this first chunk here, kind of the who, what, when, where, why. Just your take on anything we've been talking about. I threw some opinions in on some of this too. You probably picked up on some of those. Yeah, Jeff?
So performance versus just sort of knowledge. So performance is more application, for one thing. How can you apply this knowledge? How can you put it in a context that... So it's a higher level assessment, right?
Right. I think good performance assessment, though, it also involves the use of some things that are at a lower level as well, too. And often before you can do synthesis, before you can do evaluation, before you can do application, you know, you need to know something. You've got to have something there. So I'm not saying performance assessment can't measure those lower level things. I think it can. I think it's not very efficient at that. But if that's all you're using it for, you've got problems. I think you really want to use it for that application, that idea of the analysis, the synthesis, the evaluation.
Because so often I've tried to do that, but then I discover they don't have the vocabulary.
Yes.
Right? They don't have the tools to talk about these things.
Yep. That's the scaffolding I'm talking
So
about.
somehow I need to help them guarantee that they have that lower level.
Exactly. Exactly. And a lot of times what I'll do with students is, when I'm delivering information, if you want to call it that, I'll let them know that in about 30 minutes, you're going to have to use this now in some way. And they've learned pretty much with my teaching that anytime I'm delivering content in some way, they're literally going to have to do something with it. And I let them know that. And I'll say, this is kind of interesting, but we're going to really do something with this, so be ready for it. So kind of letting them know. But that scaffolding piece is critical. If you have a good performance assessment that doesn't work, usually the reason is the instruction was not there ahead of time to support the success of it. So you've got to go back. We know where our students want to be. We want them here. Sometimes they're here. We need to figure those little levels that are going to get them there. We can't jump them from here to there all of a sudden. Yeah.
I was going to say this, the objections that you brought up got my brain going back to the conversations that I heard in all my research classes long, long ago between people who tended to prefer quantitative methods and people who tended to qualitative methods. And how, you have little camps.
Yeah.
And people argue about how useful their method is and what it's useful for. And just how both methods are incredibly useful for doing completely different things.
Exactly.
And it almost feels like, because of the potentially subjective nature of performance assessments, that you could almost, this may feel simplistic, that you could drop that into more of a qualitative cave and say this is really more the qualitative end of things. This is because the kinds of responses the person is giving is going to be more unique to them, to their experiences. It's going to be less generalizable by definition, just because they're bringing all sorts of variables in that you can't predict.
Yeah.
But you know,
Yeah,
is that accurate? Or
I think to some degree it is. I'm going to suggest a model that I think is going to bring a little more objectivity, to performance assessment than sometimes you see. So, but I think Jenny, it's accurate. What you're saying. These are tools. Traditional assessment is a tool. Performance assessment is a tool. What's important is to think about when I use each of the tools. That's what's really important. And it could be very appropriate in a class that Jim, a much higher level class Jim has, for example, where he has got all performance assessment, or almost all performance assessment. Could be very appropriate for that same instructor at a different class, where maybe he's got 3/4 traditional assessment and a little bit of performance assessment, going on. So it really depends what your outcomes are. But these are tools that skillful instructors have. You need to know kind of when to use them, you need to know how to use them, in a sense.
This is intriguing to me as a musician.
Yep.
Because the word performance is, that's what you do.
Exactly.
And for my majors, their assessment is their juries or the end of the semester.
Yep.
When I have other students, though, who are taking it for their A credit or whatever, I have to be a little bit more creative in thinking about how am I going to assess what they've learned, and I take the approach that each week I'm doing some kind of assessment in seeing, okay, what I presented to them the week before, are they getting it or are they not getting it?
Yep.
But I'm wondering if I should maybe think of maybe some sort of written tool, something that's modest, but something that I could use along with the actual, okay, the playing that's the proof of the pudding right there.
Right.
But are there some things that, that I can make sure that they know?
Yep.
That they have to have?
Yep. I think it's a really good thought. Think what are those non-negotiables, the things that absolutely have to be there, and you want to know if they're there.
Right.
So the idea of combining some traditional with some performance, that can be very, very appropriate. Yeah, makes a ton of sense. Angela?
I kind of use both too, because I have say, for instance, portrait writing and creative writing. You do the traditional bit with just learning, making sure that they're reading and learning craft. And then with the performance, I think there is a leap where, the goal is to have them put the craft that they're learning into their writing.
Yep.
But for some students it works well, and for some students it, is missing.
Yeah.
So,
yeah.
And I do try to create some kind of rubric that they can look at, but but I would love for it to work better. Or have it be more consistent for for large group of students or everybody, where they can go from learning about craft to actually crafting.
Yeah. Yeah, exactly. That's the point we want to take them. And they resist sometimes going to that point because it's often easier just to kind of sit and take the stuff in, but now I got to use it. That, like I was talking about originally, now I got to think. I got to be original, in some way. That's a different level of work and uncomfortable for some people, especially those that are really good at memorizing things and regurgitating things.
And I would argue that it is more generalizable because they are having to apply it to something in an original way, which is what we want them to do.
In a real setting, as real as you can make it.
It's not going to look like what it does in this classroom. So I think in a way, there's the whole idea about the validity, reliability, and generalizability can be improved as well.
Yeah. Yeah, I know you're disciplined because it's what my daughter does. So, yeah. I think if all you gave was true-false matching multiple choice test in social work, that would be ridiculous, to really say that they now know these things, and when they go out into the field, they can apply all this stuff with no measure of that up to that point. Yeah. Go.
I was just wondering if you talk about the scaffolding thing.
Yes.
But in a way, it seems like departments have to work more closely with each other because you can't do some things in a given course. And how that maybe affects a traditional culture in a university where I do my own class my own way, but maybe curriculum mapping becomes really
Exactly.
critical.
Exactly. Yep. And we wind up with all kinds of gaps, and we wind up with all kinds of overlap because we don't often have those discussions. Those are valuable because that's all that scaffolding piece that we're talking about. Yep. Well, let me just move on a little bit. Want to lay out a model for you here. I'm just going to say how performance assessment is practiced in assessment design outline. The outline I'm going to show you is an original design based on a bunch of research. I've actually published on this thing several years ago. So we're going to take a look at kind of the model first here. Sorry. So if you want to flip over to page 2, let's just take a look at the model. Now it's going to start with the idea of having outcomes, which is probably no surprise to you. The thing I'm going to suggest on this is that when you're building a performance assessment, I think that the more outcomes you can address through one performance assessment, I think the smarter you're being with it. Because to build one of these, for the student to do one, for you to critique one, is quite a bit of work. So I'm saying whenever you can lump together 2, 3, 4, 5, I've seen as many as 10 outcomes that could be addressed in a single performance assessment. Okay, I think that's smart to do because we can't give students 20 performance assessments, if we've got 20 objectives. So look for ones that you can lump together. Okay, I think that's a really big help. Then you're going to have what I call a performance criteria. And what I mean by that is this is going to be what are the indicators of success. Now these indicators of success are something that you'd want to have written down, and it's also something you want to show to the student. So what you're basically thinking is, what are my outcomes? And then you're thinking to yourself, how would I know if they were successful? What is it that I would see? What is it that I would hear? What is it that I would read that would lead me to believe that they were successful with that? Okay? Third part of it then is going to be what I just call the performance process. And that really is going to be an explanation to the students of what they're going to do. Now that can come step 1, step 2, step 3. It can come 1, 2, 3, 4. It can be bullet pointed, however you want to put it. But it really is written to the students as clear, concise as you can make it. Okay, that's the part that they often don't like. They think we're not very clear with what we're asking. And they're probably right, some of the time. But the process is really what they're going to do. Then 2 parts that are often not really thought about by us, unfortunately. And the 4th part is what I call performance judgment. And that's where we're going to think about how the process is going to be judged and exactly who's going to be doing the judgment. Now, we often think that we're going to read it and we're going to judge it. But we don't often go beyond that. We don't tap into some other sources that could be really helpful in terms of making that judgment. So in a little bit, I'm going to suggest some different ways to think about that. And then the other part that's really critical is for us to think about how we're giving our feedback. Now, what we normally think is we get the paper, we write comments on it, we give it back to the student. That's what we normally think of. But oftentimes, there can be a lot more productive ways of giving feedback to somebody. Talking with them, for example. A novel concept, but often that can be a whole lot more effective way of communicating feedback. So what I'm going to suggest is that we really need to kind of think through, that feedback process too. If you flip over to page 3 in here, you're going to see a little more explanation of kind of the process that I've outlined. And for the outcome, I've laid out just some guidelines on writing outcomes, and then performance criteria. Again, these are some things written down there to really think about. The process, same thing with the judgment, and then with the feedback as well. Now, the part that feels backwards for us in this oftentimes is the part we usually get our outcomes, and then we normally jump down to this one. Okay, in our mind, we think, here are my outcomes, here are what I want students to do, and then we think, how am I going to assess it? That's how our mind normally works. So it's a little bit backward in a sense that I'm suggesting you really think about this before you think about what that's going to be. So you're really trying to flesh out what's the evidence that they have achieved that. And then you start to really build whatever that experience is, that your students are going to have. then what I like to do just personally, after I built this, built that, I go back and then think, all right, so I'm going to get these things in, these papers from them, these projects, whatever. Is there anything else that I know that I'm going to be looking for here that would be really, help me clearly know what's a good paper, what's a bad paper? So I will occasionally add some things to this at that point. Okay, so it's a little bit, very simple, but just a little bit different than how we normally think of some things. I want to show you a couple examples, and then we're gonna stop again here too. All right, so I want to show you. I'm going to show you first on online ad. I didn't know you were coming that, but we got lucky on this one. If you look at page 5.
This is the performance assessment accident.
This is actually, it's one. She wouldn't mind if I said it. It's one that Kara put together.
Yeah,
So,
I believe it.
all right, so page 5. You can see what Kara's outcomes are. I'm going to use her name here. She wouldn't mind probably. All right, you can see her outcomes. These are the criteria. This was the evidence that she was really looking for. Okay. And then she just went 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, laid out her whole process. Concrete sequentials love that approach, by the way. You can use paragraphs if you want, or you can do it other ways. And then, in terms of her judgment, then she's using something called a check brick. Okay. You can see what that looks like. That's on page 6 then. And then at the end, you can see what she's doing for her judgment and for her feedback. Now, the point that I want to make in particular is when you look at this check brick, when you look at the check brick that she's got here, any other kind of tool that you're using, what you want to do, and this is what I check them for, I look for alignment. And when I say alignment, I mean alignment between the items that are on this. This is what the students are looking for. This is what you're looking for. This should align directly with your criteria. So whatever those criteria are, whatever you've decided to be important, that should be reflected in whatever device that you've got. So if you don't think through that criteria very well, honestly, this device isn't going to look very good. And if you don't double check to be sure you've got alignment, this device isn't going to look very good either. So you want to be sure those two pieces are really in place. Now this model, I'm showing you this. I don't know anybody else that teaches it exactly this way, but it's based on looking at a whole variety of different models. I've used this for probably 12 to 15 years. It's been the model that I run. Very simple, but I think it's worked out fairly well. I'm going to show you one more, and I did know Nathan would be here, so I threw a math one in. I took it down to it's actually an Algebra 2 one, so it's not quite what you work with. But just look at a different style. She's got her outcomes. She's running 3 of them there. Those are her criteria. You can see her process. And then in terms of her judgment, she's using, it's a nice little checklist. It's a combo thing. She's got a checklist, and she's got a rubric that's going with that one. And if you flip over to page 9, you can see she's pretty detailed with it. I'm a big fan of checklists when there's a lot of things, pieces that need to be in place. It really holds students accountable for being sure those pieces are there. Then you can see what she did for her feedback as well then too. These are just a couple models, very different disciplines. Yep. Okay, so let's just kind of stop there. This is, yep. Mm-hmm. Go ahead.
The criteria
Yep.
can be in the second model, the second column. Is that right?
Yes.
So the first column.
You're talking about on this one, the check brick? This one?
No, this
Oh, I'm sorry, I misunderstood.
Yeah. So
Yeah,
it seems to me like the
yeah, this
process or the
I'm sorry, I answered your question wrong. But the criteria is more so on the right-hand side.
right,
Yeah, that's the right-hand side.
and the left side is the front.
Yeah, a little more of the process, the steps. Be sure this is in place, that's in place. But you definitely want to give the whole deal to the students because they know this is what you're going to be critiquing them on. So this is just a combo type thing. Yeah, and you've got parts of the criteria on the left side too, but the bulk of the criteria, all the criteria is on the right. If you check the alignment,
that are expected are on the left.
Exactly.
And the quality of it.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. But like I said, if you do check this alignment with their criteria, you'll see a real nice match on it. Jim?
Yeah, I love the idea because I think the student is assessing themselves.
Mm-hmm.
They're assessing themselves, which is really important because sometimes they don't know what they, and then also they know exactly how you're going to be assessing them too, or the criteria. That's very nice. It makes me think I need to build in student checklists. Okay, like when they turn in their project, there's a checklist there, and they're assessing or they're reminding themselves what they have to do.
Yeah. I'm going to pick up on two things you said. You'll notice in every device I've got here, there's a self-assessment component to it. I'm a really big believer in that because when our students leave us, when they go off into the work world or whatever they're doing, somebody's not going to be running around after that. Telling them, oh, you did well, you got a 4 on this, you got a 3 on that, and a 2 on that. And, that ability to assess your own work is a developmental skill that doesn't just automatically happen. So actually, every device I've got in here has a self-assessment component. So I'm trying to build that skill. But the other thing I found is when a student starts to self-assess and they see, I've got to give myself a 2 here. This isn't a 4. They will often go back and redo it. It holds them accountable for that criteria. It really brings it to their attention. So I found since I've added self-assessment, I don't do it on every single thing I do, but since I've added it, I get better work out of them. But first time round on this thing, this is used, I guarantee this will not be perfect. And what will happen, and you know this too, that you get the performance assessment in, whether it's a paper, project, whatever it is, and there's going to be things you're not happy with in what you see. Then you come back and you refine these. I think it takes 2 times, maybe 3 times, to get it exactly the way you want it. And often we have too much detail, and students don't read it. So sometimes you can improve things by actually simplifying things too. Don't always think that if I make it longer, it's going to be better. Often it's the contrary. They will not read it if it gets to be too long. So it's really refining things.
I know you got to get to your class piece here in a
Yeah.
second, but what would you say to instructors who object to being, and we find ourselves in this position as a team a lot,
Right.
where we're asking instructors to be very specific about what they want learners to do in the assignments that they're giving them, which is not this entire thing you're talking about, but it has to do with the criteria for the assignment, what needs to be included.
Yeah.
The common objection we will get from instructors is, I feel like I'm just programming them too heavily with this. I feel like I'm removing creativity from their process. I
Right.
feel like I'm running them down a road and they're going to stop thinking.
Yeah.
Obviously, I don't think that's the case.
Right. It
But-
can be the case. I will actually build into criteria creativity at times. I will have that be one of my criteria. So if it's something that I want them really thinking outside of the box, that is one of my criteria. And if they are not being creative, if they are not thinking outside of the box, I comment on that. So you can go both ways with it. You think where you want to be specific, but you be intentional when you want things open-ended. And I think you can run both
for
ways.
instance, I want something here that we did not go over in class, that we did not discuss in the class. You want them, so rewarding them for outside thoughts.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah. Well, let's just look at a couple other things real quick. And you can just glance at these. Page 10, this is something called a scoring guide. I'm just showing you a couple different models, and I'm not married to any of these as being the best, but page 11, you can run what's called a list, a performance assessment list in some way. And these are devices that can work well with different assignments. 12 is a variation of a rubric. I'm not going into rubrics right now because that would be an entire hour. But there's a lot of good sites that can get you started on more traditional style rubrics. And I'm a pretty big fan of something called a check brick now. And a check brick, it's a checklist. That's where the check, and then the brick is kind of the rubric part. So, and you had an example there. They've got a checklist things, yet they still see, really what those criteria are. Those are some devices. If anybody wants any of those electronically, I can send them to you, and they've got columns and colors, and they look a little fancy. So if you're interested in that, just let me know. Okay. And then I think we're just going to jump to this one real quick here because we're fighting the clock a little bit. I think that when you think about quality assessment, I honestly think it can be boiled down to 3 really simple questions. And these are questions students need to ask themselves. First of all, they need to know, where am I going? When they're in your class, they need to know, where are they going? And that's, in a sense, kind of your job, partially their job, but mostly your job, to really convey your outcomes clearly to them. They need to know what are my targets? I use learning targets. What are my learning targets for this class? They need to know that. And then they need to know continually, where am I now? They need to have a sense of that. Where am I in terms of achieving these targets? And then they need to think intelligently about, how can I close that gap? They're going to see where they are. They kind of know where they need to go. And that's where your formative assessment is really going to help them come into play. So what I'm going to show you next really relates to the second question and the third question. Okay? So let's just take a look at it. So I think by giving quality feedback, generally speaking, it's delivered during instruction. Okay? So it's during the course experience. It's not at the end of the semester. I'm sure you've all had those experiences where you've got a final paper that you're supposed to write. Take yourself back to your college days. You got this final paper you're supposed to write. You get no feedback on the whole paper. You turn it in at the end of the semester. The instructor puts a B on it, and they say, great paper. You have learned nothing through that experience. Okay, that's not what we're talking about. A well-written paper is going to be the product of a process where you've got formative assessment. You've got feedback continually throughout. Okay, real quick, it's specific in pointing out where the learning targets have been met and where improvement is needed. And what the research shows is that students will learn significantly when they see what they have done well in something. Okay? And often you'll get more gains by pointing out what somebody's done well than you will pointing out just what they've done wrong. Okay? So they need to know that. Now the third point, quality feedback typically will have these three, and I'm going to use your words here, feedback loops to some degree. And this would be the self-assessment piece we're talking about. And what we're finding, especially at a college level, is that this peer feedback can be pretty powerful for students if it's based on something other than just pure opinion, of the student. If you have good criteria and the peers are using that criteria to apply, that can be really powerful, sometimes more powerful than the instructor. Okay? But often those three pieces. Now, would I say all the time? No. We just can't do it. But it's pretty powerful. We often miss the first one and we miss the second one. We jump right to the third one oftentimes. And then it avoids focus on the negatives, grades, or class rank. Okay? And I'm not saying it never deals with those, but I'm saying the focus has got to be on the learning process. That's got to be what the focus is. Okay? If it's only this, research shows that it actually can be a bit counterproductive in terms of the student really learning, taking it in deeply. They become, they play the game, of being a student, just trying to get a grade. And then kind of the last one, there's one more, but kind of praise effort more than ability. And often if we jump to this one, just the ability part, students have the impression that they're like born musicians or they're born mathematicians, that no matter what they do, they're probably not going to be very good at it. So when you kind of point to that effort, that's a critical thing. You're certainly pointing to how well they've achieved the criteria, for sure, but generally speaking, I'm suggesting try to stay away from this for the most part. I would like to believe that everybody can be a skillful musician, a skillful scientist, a skillful writer, a skillful mathematician. And you need to help them think they can be those things. And then just the final one, quality feedback, really avoids giving more advice than they can do something with. And boy, we can often see a zillion ways, something can be tweaked. But it's got to be something that they can act on, in some way. And then in your packet, we'll just give you a chance to kind of look through it. But in your packet, on page 14, there's kind of some additional kind of 5 research points that are in there. And then, Jim, you were actually asking about clickers a little bit earlier. This is actually an interview that I did with Sarah that I think is a really strong one on assessment, and it's got the clicker piece in it as well, too. So you've got the site there, so you can just kind of shoot down to that one as well, too. Yeah.
Jay, was the last slide on here?
Pardon?
Was the last slide on here about the quality feedback?
It's not in here.
Oh, okay.
No, I didn't put that. That got written yesterday, actually. Not written. Yeah. Okay. So, thanks for being here. I wish, again, I always wish we had a little more time, but something to think about. And I think hold on to these models. I think these can be helpful to some degree too. Yeah. So, I'm happy to talk a little more if you want to stay after for anything. But thanks for coming.